This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Opheliad in New South Wales, Australia. November 2006. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 5. Turning a New Leaf. My mistress being dead, and I once more alone, I had to look out for a new place. About this time I might be a very little, shaken in nerves. I grant I was not looking well, but, on the contrary, thin, haggard, and hollow-eyed, like a sitter up at night, like an overwrought servant or a placeless person in debt. In debt, however, I was not, nor quite poor, for though Miss Marchmont had not had time to benefit me, as on that last night she said she intended, yet after the funeral my wages were duly paid by her second cousin, the heir, an avaricious-looking man, with pinched nose and narrow temples, who indeed, I heard long afterwards, turned out a thorough miser, a direct contrast to his generous kinswoman, and a foil to her memory, blessed to this day by the poor and needy. The possessor then of £15, of health, though worn, not broken, and of a spirit in similar condition, I might still, in comparison with many people, be regarded as occupying an enviable position. An embarrassing one it was, however, at the same time, as I felt with some acuteness on a certain day, of which the corresponding one in the next week was to see my departure from my present abode, while with another I was not provided. In this dilemma I went, as a last and sole resource, to see and consult an old servant of our family, once my nurse, now housekeeper at a grand mansion not far from Miss Marchmont's. I spent some hours with her. She comforted, but knew not how to advise me. Still all inward darkness, I left her about twilight. A walk of 2 miles lay before me. It was a clear frosty night. In spite of my solitude, my poverty, and my perplexity, my heart, nourished and nerved with the vigour of a youth that had not yet counted 23 summers, beat light and not feebly. Not feebly, I am sure, or I should have trembled in that lonely walk, which lay through still fields, and passed neither village nor farmhouse nor cottage. I should have quailed in the absence of moonlight, for it was by the leading of stars only I traced the dim path. I should have quailed still more in the unwonted presence of that which to-night shone in the north, a moving mystery, the aurora borealis. But this solemn stranger influenced me otherwise than through my fears. Some new power it seemed to bring. I drew in energy with the keen, low breeze that blew on its path. A bold thought was sent to my mind. My mind was made strong to receive it. "Leave this wilderness," it was said to me, "and go out hence." "Where?" was the query. I had not very far to look. Gazing from this country parish in that flat, rich middle of England, I mentally saw within reach what I had never yet beheld with my bodily eyes. I saw London. The next day I returned to the hall, and asking once more to see the housekeeper, I communicated to her my plan. Mrs. Barrett was a grave, judicious woman, though she knew little more of the world than myself, but grave and judicious as she was, she did not charge me with being out of my senses. And indeed I had a staid manner of my own, which ere now had been as good to me as cloak and hood of hodden grey, since under its favour I had been enabled to achieve with impunity, and even approbation, deeds that, if attempted with an excited and unsettled air, would in some minds have stamped me as a dreamer and a zealot. The housekeeper was slowly propounding some difficulties while she prepared orange rind for marmalade, when a child ran past the window and came bounding into the room. It was a pretty child, and as it danced, laughing up to me, for we were not strangers, nor indeed was its mother, a young married daughter of the house, a stranger, I took it on my knee. Different as were our social positions now, this child's mother and I had been schoolfellows, when I was a girl of 10, and she a young lady of 16, and I remembered her, good-looking, but dull, in a lower class than mine. I was admiring the boy's handsome dark eyes, when the mother, young Mrs. Lee, entered. What a beautiful and kind-looking woman was the good-natured and comely but unintellectual girl become! Wifehood and maternity had changed her thus, as I have since seen them change others even less promising than she. Me she had forgotten. I was changed too, though not, I fear, for the better. I made no attempt to recall myself to her memory. Why should I? She came for her son to accompany her in a walk, and behind her followed a nurse carrying an infant. I only mention the incident because, in addressing the nurse, Mrs. Lee spoke French, very bad French, by the way, and with an incorrigibly bad accent, again forcibly reminding me of our school days, and I found the woman was a foreigner. The little boy chattered volubly in French too. When the whole party were withdrawn, Mrs. Barrett remarked that her young lady had brought that foreign nurse home with her 2 years ago, on her return from a continental excursion, that she was treated almost as well as a governess, and had nothing to do but walk out with the baby and chatter French with Master Charles. And, added Mrs. Barrett, she says there are many Englishwomen in foreign families as well placed as she. I stored up this piece of casual information, as careful housewives store seemingly worthless shreds and fragments for which their prescient minds anticipate a possible use some day. Before I left my old friend, she gave me the address of a respectable old-fashioned inn in the city, which, she said, my uncles used to frequent in former days. In going to London I ran less risk and evinced less enterprise than the reader may think. In fact, the distance was only 50 miles. My means would suffice both to take me there, to keep me a few days, and also to bring me back if I found no inducement to stay. I regarded it as a brief holiday, permitted for once to work-weary faculties rather than as an adventure of life and death. There is nothing like taking all you do at a moderate estimate. It keeps mind and body tranquil, whereas grandiloquent notions are apt to hurry both into fever. 50 miles were then a day's journey, for I speak of a time gone by. My hair, which till a late period withstood the frosts of time, lies now at last white under a white cap, like snow beneath snow. About 9 o'clock of a wet February night I reached London. My reader, I know, is one who would not thank me for an elaborate reproduction of poetic first impressions, and it is well, inasmuch as I had neither time nor mood to cherish such. Arriving as I did late, on a dark, raw, and rainy evening, in a Babylon and a wilderness, of which the vastness and the strangeness tried to the utmost any powers of clear thought and steady self-possession with which, in the absence of more brilliant faculties, nature might have gifted me. When I left the coach, the strange speech of the cabmen and others waiting round seemed to me odd as a foreign tongue. I had never before heard the English language chopped up in that way. However, I managed to understand and to be understood, so far as to get myself and trunk safely conveyed to the old inn whereof I had the address. How difficult, how oppressive, how puzzling seemed my flight! In London for the first time, at an inn for the first time, tired with travelling, confused with darkness, palsied with cold, unfurnished with either experience or advice to tell me how to act, and yet to act obliged. Into the hands of common sense I confided the matter. Common sense, however, was as chilled and bewildered as all my other faculties, and it was only under the spur of an inexorable necessity that she spasmodically executed her trust. Thus urged, she paid the porter. Considering the crisis, I did not blame her too much that she was hugely cheated. She asked the waiter for a room. She timorously called for the chambermaid. What is far more, she bore, without being wholly overcome, a highly supercilious style of demeanour from that young lady when she appeared. I recollect this same chambermaid was a pattern of town prettiness and smartness. So trim her waist, her cap, her dress. I wondered how they had all been manufactured. Her speech had an accent which, in its mincing glibness, seemed to rebuke mine as by authority. Her spruce attire flaunted an easy scorn to my plain country garb. Well, it can't be helped, I thought. And then the scene is new, and the circumstances. I shall gain good. Maintaining a very quiet manner towards this arrogant little maid, and subsequently observing the same towards the parsonic-looking black-coated white neckclothed waiter, I got civility from them ere long. I believe at first they thought I was a servant, but in a little while they changed their minds, and hovered in a doubtful state between patronage and politeness. I kept up well till I had partaken of some refreshment, warmed myself by a fire, and was fairly shut into my own room. But as I sat down by the bed and rested my head and arms on the pillow, a terrible oppression overcame me. All at once my position rose on me like a ghost. Anomalous, desolate, almost blank of hope it stood. What was I doing here alone in great London? What should I do on the morrow? What prospects had I in life? What friends had I on earth? Whence did I come? Whither should I go? What should I do? I wet the pillow, my arms, and my hair with rushing tears. A dark interval of most bitter thought followed this burst, but I did not regret the step taken, nor wish to retract it. A strong vague persuasion that it was better to go forward than backward, and that I could go forward, that a way, however narrow and difficult, would in time open, predominated over other feelings. Its influence hushed them so far, that at last I became sufficiently tranquil to be able to say my prayers and seek my couch. I had just extinguished my candle and lain down, when a deep, low, mighty tone swung through the night. At first I knew it not, but it was uttered 12 times, and at the 12th colossal hum and trembling knell I said, "I lie in the shadow of St. Paul's." End of chapter 5.
LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Heather Barnett. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 6. London. The next day was the 1st of March, and when I awoke, rose, and opened my curtain, I saw the risen sun struggling through fog. Above my head, above the housetops, co-elevate almost with the clouds, I saw a solemn, orbed mass, dark blue and dim, the dome. While I looked, my inner self moved. My spirit shook its always fettered wings, half loose. I had a sudden feeling as if I, who never yet truly lived, were at last about to taste life. In that morning my soul grew as fast as Jonah's gourd. "I did well to come," I said, proceeding to dress with speed and care. "I like the spirit of this great London which I feel around me. Who but a coward would pass his whole life in hamlets, and for ever abandon his faculties to the eating rust of obscurity?" Being dressed, I went down, not travel-worn and exhausted, but tidy and refreshed. When the waiter came in with my breakfast, I managed to accost him sedately, yet cheerfully. We had 10 minutes' discourse, in the course of which we became usefully known to each other. He was a grey-haired, elderly man, and it seemed had lived in his present place 20 years. Having ascertained this, I was sure he must remember my 2 uncles, Charles and Wilmot, who 15 years ago were frequent visitors here. I mentioned their names. He recalled them perfectly, and with respect. Having intimated my connection, my position in his eyes was henceforth clear, and on a right footing. He said I was like my Uncle Charles. I suppose he spoke truth, because Mrs. Barrett was accustomed to say the same thing. A ready and obliging courtesy now replaced his former uncomfortably doubtful manner. Henceforth I need no longer be at a loss for a civil answer to a sensible question. The street on which my little sitting-room window looked was narrow, perfectly quiet, and not dirty. The few passengers were just such as one sees in provincial towns. Here was nothing formidable. I felt sure I might venture out alone. Having breakfasted, out I went. Elation and pleasure were in my heart. To walk alone in London seemed of itself an adventure. Presently I found myself in Paternoster Row, classic ground this. I entered a bookseller's shop, kept by one Jones. I bought a little book, a piece of extravagance I could ill afford, but I thought I would one day give or send it to Mrs. Barrett. Mr. Jones, a dried-in man of business, stood behind his desk. He seemed one of the greatest, and I one of the happiest beings. Prodigious was the amount of life I lived that morning. Finding myself before St. Paul's, I went in. I mounted to the dome. I saw thence London, with its river, and its bridges, and its churches. I saw antique Westminster, and the green Temple Gardens, with sun upon them, and a glad blue sky of early spring above, and between them and it, not too dense, a cloud of haze. Descending, I went wandering whither chance might lead, in a still ecstasy of freedom and enjoyment, and I got, I know not how, I got into the heart of city life. I saw and felt London at last. I got into the Strand. I went up Cornhill. I mixed with the life passing along. I dared the perils of crossings. To do this, and to do it utterly alone, gave me, perhaps an irrational but a real pleasure. Since those days I have seen the West End, the parks, the fine squares, but I love the city far better. The city seems so much more in earnest. Its business, its rush, its roar are such serious things, sights and sounds. The city is getting its living, the West End but enjoying its pleasure. At the West End you may be amused, but in the city you are deeply excited. Faint at last and hungry, it was years since I had felt such healthy hunger, I returned about 2 o'clock to my dark, old, and quiet inn. I dined on 2 dishes, a plain joint and vegetables; both seemed excellent. How much better than the small dainty messes Miss Marchmont's cook used to send up to my kind dead mistress and me, and to the discussion of which we could not bring half an appetite between us. Delightfully tired, I lay down on 3 chairs for an hour. The room did not boast a sofa. I slept, then I woke and thought for 2 hours. My state of mind and all accompanying circumstances were just now such as most to favour the adoption of a new, resolute, and daring, perhaps desperate, line of action. I had nothing to lose. Unutterable loathing of a desolate existence past forbade return. If I failed in what I now designed to undertake, who save myself would suffer? If I died far away from home, I was going to say, but I had no home. From England, then, who would weep? I might suffer. I was inured to suffering. Death itself had not, I thought, those terrors for me which it has for the softly reared. I had, ere this, looked on the thought of death with a quiet eye. Prepared, then, for any consequence, I formed a project. That same evening I obtained from my friend, the waiter, information respecting the sailing of vessels for a certain continental port, Bou Marina. No time, I found, was to be lost. That very night I must take my berth. I might indeed have waited till the morning before going on board, but would not run the risk of being too late. "Better take your berth at once, ma'am," counselled the waiter. I agreed with him, and having discharged my bill, and acknowledged my friend's services at a rate which I now know was princely, and which in his eyes must have seemed absurd, and indeed, while pocketing the cash, he smiled a faint smile, which intimated his opinion of the donor's savoir-faire, he proceeded to call a coach. To the driver he also recommended me, giving at the same time an injunction about taking me, I think, to the wharf, and not leaving me to the watermen, which that functionary promised to observe, but failed in keeping his promise. On the contrary, he offered me up as an oblation, served me as a dripping roast, made me alight in the midst of a throng of watermen. This was an uncomfortable crisis. It was a dark night. The coachman instantly drove off as soon as he had got his fare. The watermen commenced a struggle for me and my trunk. Their oaths I hear at this moment. They shook my philosophy more than did the night, or the isolation, or the strangeness of the scene. One laid hands on my trunk. I looked on and waited quietly, but when another laid hands on me, I spoke up, shook off his touch, stepped at once into a boat, desired austerely that the trunk should be placed beside me, just there, which was instantly done, for the owner of the boat I had chosen became now an ally. I was rowed off. Black was the river as a torrent of ink. Lights glanced on it from the piles of buildings round. Ships rocked on its bosom. They rowed me up to several vessels. I read by lantern light their names painted in great white letters on the dark ground. The Ocean, the Phoenix, the Consort, the Dolphin were passed in turns, but the Vivid was my ship, and it seemed she lay further down. Down the sable flood we glided. I thought of the Styx, and of Charon rowing some solitary soul to the land of shades. Amidst a strange scene, with the chilly wind blowing in my face and midnight clouds dropping rain above my head, with 2 rude rowers for companions, whose insane oaths still tortured my ear, I asked myself if I was wretched or terrified. I was neither. Often in my life have I been far more so under comparatively safe circumstances. "How is this?" said I. "Methinks I am animated and alert instead of being depressed and apprehensive." I could not tell how it was. The Vivid started out, white and glaring, from the black night at last. "Here you are," said the waterman, and instantly demanded 6 shillings. "You ask too much," I said. He drew off from the vessel and swore he would not embark me till I paid it. The young man, the steward, as I found afterwards, was looking over the ship's side. He grinned a smile in anticipation of the coming contest. To disappoint him, I paid the money. 3 times that afternoon I had given crowns where I should have given shillings, but I consoled myself with the reflection, "It is the price of experience." "They've cheated you," said the steward exultantly when I got on board. I answered phlegmatically that I knew it, and went below. A stout, handsome, and showy woman was in the ladies' cabin. I asked to be shown my berth. She looked hard at me, muttered something about its being unusual for passengers to come on board at that hour, and seemed disposed to be less than civil. What a face she had! So comely, so insolent, and so selfish! "Now that I am on board, I shall certainly stay here," was my answer. "I will trouble you to show me my berth." She complied, but sullenly. I took off my bonnet, arranged my things, and lay down. Some difficulties had been passed through. A sort of victory was won. My homeless, anchorless, unsupported mind had again leisure for brief repose. Till the Vivid arrived in harbour, no further action would be required of me. But then? Oh, I could not look forward. Harassed, exhausted, I lay in a half-trance. The stewardess talked all night. Not to me, but to the young steward, her son, and her very picture. He passed in and out of the cabin continually. They disputed, they quarrelled, they made it up again 20 times in the course of the night. She professed to be writing a letter home, she said to her father. She read passages of it aloud, heeding me no more than a stock. Perhaps she believed me asleep. Several of these passages appeared to comprise family secrets, and bore special reference to one Charlotte, a younger sister, who, from the bearing of the epistle, seemed to be on the brink of perpetrating a romantic and imprudent match. Loud was the protest of this elder lady against the distasteful union. The dutiful son laughed his mother's correspondence to scorn. She defended it, and raved at him. They were a strange pair. She might be 39 or 40, and was buxom and blossoming as a girl of 20. Hard, loud, vain, and vulgar, her mind and body alike seemed brazen and imperishable. I should think, from her childhood, she must have lived in public stations, and in her youth might very likely have been a barmaid. Towards the morning her discourse ran on a new theme, the Watsons, a certain expected family party of passengers, known to her, it appeared, and by her much esteemed on account of the handsome profit realised in their fees. She said it was as good as a little fortune to her whenever this family crossed. At dawn all were astir, and by sunrise the passengers came on board. Boisterous was the welcome given by the stewardess to the Watsons, and great was the bustle made in their honour. They were 4 in number, 2 males and 2 females. Besides them, there was but one other passenger, a young lady whom a gentlemanly though languid-looking man escorted. The 2 groups offered a marked contrast. The Watsons were doubtlessly rich people, for they had the confidence of conscious wealth in their bearing. The women, youthful both of them, and one perfectly handsome as far as physical beauty went, were dressed richly, gaily, and absurdly out of character for the circumstances. Their bonnets were bright flowers, their velvet cloaks and silk dresses seemed better suited for park or promenade than for a damp packet deck. The men were of low stature, plain, fat, and vulgar. The oldest, plainest, greasiest, broadest, I soon found was the husband. The bridegroom, I suppose, for she was very young, of the beautiful girl. Deep was my amazement at this discovery, and deeper still when I perceived that, instead of being desperately wretched in such a union, she was gay even to giddiness. Her laughter, I reflected, must be the mere frenzy of despair. And even while this thought was crossing my mind, as I stood leaning quiet and solitary against the ship's side, she came tripping up to me, an utter stranger, with a camp stool in her hand, and smiling a smile of which the levity puzzled and startled me, though it showed a perfect set of perfect teeth. She offered me the accommodation of this piece of furniture. I declined it, of course, with all the courtesy I could put into my manner. She danced off heedless and lightsome. She must have been good-natured, but what had made her marry that individual, who was at least as much like an oil-barrel as a man? The other lady passenger, with the gentleman companion, was quite a girl, pretty and fair. Her simple print dress, untrimmed straw bonnet, and large shawl, gracefully worn, formed a costume plain to Quakerism, yet for her becoming enough. Before the gentleman quitted her, I observed him throwing a glance of scrutiny over all the passengers, as if to ascertain in what company his charge would be left. With a most dissatisfied air did his eye turn from the ladies with the gay flowers. He looked at me, and then he spoke to his daughter, niece, or whatever she was. She also glanced in my direction, and slightly curled her short pretty lip. It might be myself, or it might be my homely mourning habit, that elicited this mark of contempt, more likely both. A bell rang. Her father, I afterwards knew that it was her father, kissed her, and returned to land. The packet sailed. Foreigners say that it is only English girls who can thus be trusted to travel alone, and deep is their wonder at the daring confidence of English parents and guardians. As for the jeunes miss, by some their intrepidity is pronounced masculine and incontinent; others regard them as the passive victims of an educational and theological system which wantonly dispenses with proper surveillance. Whether this particular young lady was of the sort that can the most safely be left unwatched I do not know, or rather did not then know, but it soon appeared that the dignity of solitude was not to her taste. She paced the deck once or twice backwards and forwards. She looked with a little sour air of disdain at the flaunting silks and velvets, and the bears which thereon danced attendance, and eventually she approached me. "Are you fond of a sea voyage?" was her question. I explained that my fondness for a sea voyage had yet to undergo the test of experience. I had never made one. "Oh, how charming!" cried she. "I quite envy you the novelty. First impressions, you know, are so pleasant. Now I have made so many, I quite forget the first. I am quite blasée about the sea and all that." I could not help smiling. "Why do you laugh at me?" she inquired, with a frank testiness that pleased me better than her other talk. "Because you are so young to be blasée about anything." "I am 17," a little piqued. "You hardly look 16. Do you like travelling alone?" "Bah! I care nothing about it. I've crossed the Channel 10 times, alone. But then I take care never to be long alone. I always make friends." "You will scarcely make many friends this voyage, I think," glancing at the Watson group, who were now laughing and making a great deal of noise on deck. "Not of those odious men and women," said she. "Such people should be steerage passengers. Are you going to school?" "No." "Where are you going?" "I have not the least idea, beyond at least the port of Boue Marine." She stared, then carelessly ran on. "I am going to school. Oh, the number of foreign schools I have been at in my life! And yet I am quite an ignoramus. I know nothing, nothing of the world, I assure you, except that I play and dance beautifully, and French and German of course I know, to speak, but I can't read or write them very well. Do you know they wanted me to translate a page of an easy German book into English the other day, and I couldn't do it? Papa was so mortified. He says it looks as if Monsieur de Bassompierre, my godpapa, who pays all my school bills, had thrown away all his money. And then in matters of information, in history, geography, arithmetic, and so on, I'm quite a baby, and I write English so badly. Such spelling and grammar, they tell me. Into the bargain I have quite forgotten my religion. They call me a Protestant, you know, but really I'm not sure whether I am one or not. I don't well know the difference between Romanism and Protestantism. However, I don't in the least care for that. I was a Lutheran once at Bonn, dear Bonn, charming Bonn, where there were so many handsome students. Every nice girl in our school had an admirer. They knew our hours for walking out, and almost always passed us on the promenade. "Schönes Mädchen," we used to hear them say. I was excessively happy at Bonn. "And where are you now?" I inquired. "Oh, at Chose," said she. Now, Miss Ginevra Fanshawe, such was this young person's name, only substituted this word "chose" in temporary oblivion of the real name. It was a habit she had. "Chose" came in every turn in her conversation, the convenient substitute for any missing word in any language she might chance at the time to be speaking. French girls often do the like. From them she caught the custom. "Chose," however, I found in this instance, stood for Villette, the great capital of the great kingdom of Labassecour. "Do you like Villette?" I asked. "Pretty well. The natives, you know, are intensely stupid and vulgar, but there are some nice English families." "Are you in a school?" "Yes." "A good one?" "Oh no, horrid, but I go out every Sunday, and I care nothing about the maîtresse, or the professeur, or the élève, and send lessons au diable. One daren't say that in English, you know, but it sounds quite right in French, and thus I get on charmingly. You are laughing at me again?" "No, I am only smiling at my own thoughts." "What are they?" without waiting for an answer. "Now do tell me where you are going." "Where fate may lead me. My business is to earn a living where I can find it." "To earn?" in consternation. "Are you poor, then?" "As poor as Job." "Bah! How unpleasant! But I know what it is to be poor. They are poor enough at home, papa and mamma, and all of them. Papa is called Captain Fanshawe. He is an officer on half pay, but well descended, and some of our connections are great enough. But my uncle and godpapa de Bassompierre, who lives in France, is the only one that helps us. He educates us girls." I have 5 sisters and 3 brothers. By and by we are to marry. Rather elderly gentlemen, I suppose, with cash. Papa and mamma manage that. My sister Augusta is married now to a man much older looking than papa. Augusta is very beautiful, not in my style, but dark. Her husband, Mr. Davies, had the yellow fever in India, and he is still the colour of a guinea. But then he is rich, and Augusta has her carriage and establishment, and we all think she has done perfectly well. Now this is better than earning a living, as you say. By the way, are you clever? No, not at all. You can play, sing, speak 3 or 4 languages? By no means. Still, I think you are clever. A pause and a yawn. Shall you be seasick? Shall you? Oh, immensely. As soon as ever we get in sight of the sea. I begin indeed to feel it already. I shall go below. And won't I order about that fat, odious stewardess. Heureusement, je sais faire à la mon monde. Down she went. It was not long before the other passengers followed her. Throughout the afternoon I remained on deck alone. When I recall the tranquil and even happy mood in which I passed those hours, and remember at the same time the position in which I was placed, its hazardous, some would have said its hopeless character, I feel that, as stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. So peril, loneliness, an uncertain future, are not oppressive evils, so long as the frame is healthy and the faculties are employed, so long especially as liberty lends us her wings, and hope guides us by her star. I was not sick till long after we passed Margate, and deep was the pleasure I drank in with the sea breeze, divine the delight I drew from the heaving channel waves, from the sea birds on their ridges, from the white sails on their dark distance, from the quiet yet beclouded sky overhanging all. In my reverie, methought I saw the continent of Europe, like a wide dreamland far away. Sunshine lay on it, making the long coast one line of gold, tiniest tracery of clustered town and snow-gleaming tower, of wood's steep nest, of heights serrated, of smooth pasturage and veiny stream, embossed the metal-bright prospect. For background spread the sky, solemn and dark blue, and, grand with imperial promise, soft with tints of enchantment, strode from north to south a god-bent bow, an arch of hope. Cancel the whole of that, if you please, reader, or rather let it stand and draw thence a moral, an alliterative text-hand copy. Daydreams are delusions of the demon. Becoming excessively sick, I faltered down into the cabin. Miss Fanshawe's berth chanced to be next to mine, and I am sorry to say she tormented me with an unsparing selfishness during the whole time of our mutual distress. Nothing could exceed her impatience and fretfulness. The Watsons, who were very sick too, and on whom the stewardess attended with shameless partiality, were stoics compared with her. Many a time since have I noticed in persons of Ginevra Fanshawe's light, careless temperament, and fair fragile style of beauty, an entire incapacity to endure. They seem to sour in adversity, like small beer in thunder. The man who takes such a woman for his wife ought to be prepared to guarantee her an existence all sunshine. Indignant at last with her teasing peevishness, I curtly requested her to hold her tongue. The rebuff did good, and it was observable that she liked me no worse for it. As dark night drew on, the sea roughened. Larger waves swayed strong against the vessel's side. It was strange to reflect that blackness and water were round us, and to feel the ship ploughing straight on her pathless way, despite noise, billow, and rising gale. Articles of furniture began to fall about, and it became needful to lash them to their places. The passengers grew sicker than ever. Miss Fanshawe declared with groans that she must die. "Not just yet, honey," said the stewardess. "We're just in port." Accordingly, in another quarter of an hour, a calm fell upon us all, and about midnight the voyage ended. I was sorry. Yes, I was sorry. My resting time was past. My stringent difficulties recommenced. When I went on deck, the cold air and black scowl of the night seemed to rebuke me for my presumption in being where I was. The lights of the foreign seaport town, glimmering round the foreign harbour, met me like unnumbered threatening eyes. Friends came on board to welcome the Watsons. A whole family of friends surrounded and bore away Miss Fanshawe. But I dared not for one moment dwell on a comparison of physicians. Yet where should I go? I must go somewhere. Necessity dared not be nice. As I gave the stewardess her fee, and she seemed surprised at receiving a coin of more value than, from such a quarter, her coarse calculations had probably reckoned on, I said, Be kind enough to direct me to some quiet, respectable inn, where I can go for the night." She not only gave me the required direction, but called a commissionaire, and bid him take charge of me, and not my trunk, for that was gone to the custom-house. I followed this man along a rudely paved street, lit now by a fitful gleam of moonlight. He brought me to the inn. I offered him 6d, which he refused to take, supposing it not enough. I changed it for a shilling, but this also he declined, speaking rather sharply, in a language to me unknown. A waiter coming forward into the lamp-lit inn passage reminded me, in broken English, that my money was foreign money, not current here. I gave him a sovereign to change. This little matter settled, I asked for a bedroom. Supper I could not take. I was still seasick and unnerved, and trembling all over. How deeply glad I was when the door of a very small chamber at length closed on me and my exhaustion. Again I might rest, though the cloud of doubt would be as thick to-morrow as ever, the necessity for exertion more urgent, the peril of destitution nearer, the conflict for existence more severe. End of chapter 6.
LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain, and for more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Luoma. greenkri.com. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 7. Villette. I awoke next morning with courage revived and spirits refreshed. Physical debility no longer enervated my judgment. My mind felt prompt and clear. Just as I finished dressing, a tap came to the door. I said, "Come in," expecting the chambermaid, whereas a rough man walked in and said, "Give me your keys, miss." "Why?" I asked. "Gif," said he impatiently, and as he half snatched them from my hand, he added, "All right, have your trunk soon." Fortunately, it did turn out all right. He was from the custom-house. Where to go to get some breakfast I could not tell, but I proceeded, not without hesitation, to descend. I now observed, what I had not noticed in my extreme weariness last night, viz. that this inn was in fact a large hotel, and as I slowly descended the broad staircase, halting on each step, for I was in wonderfully little haste to get down, I gazed at the high ceiling above me, at the painted walls around, at the wide windows which filled the house with light, at the veined marble I trod, for which steps were all of marble, although uncarpeted and not very clean, and contrasting all this with the dimensions of the closet assigned to me as a chamber, with the extreme modesty of its appointments, I fell into a philosophizing mood. Much I marvelled at the sagacity evinced by waiters and chambermaids in proportioning the accommodation to the guest. How could inn-servants and ship-stewardesses everywhere tell at a glance that I, for instance, was an individual of no social significance and little burdened by cash? They did know it, evidently. I saw quite well that they all, in a moment's calculation, estimated me at about the same fractional value. The fact seemed to me curious and pregnant. I would not disguise from myself what it indicated, yet managed to keep up my spirits pretty well under its pressure. Having at last landed in a great hall, full of skylight glare, I made my way somehow to what proved to be the coffee-room. It cannot be denied that on entering this room I trembled somewhat, felt uncertain, solitary, wretched. I wished to heaven I knew whether I was doing right or wrong. I felt convinced that it was the last, but could not help myself. Acting in the spirit and with the calm of a fatalist, I sat down at a small table, to which a waiter presently brought me some breakfast. And I partook of that meal in a frame of mind not greatly calculated to favour digestion. There were many other people breakfasting at the other tables in the room. I should have felt rather more happy if amongst them all I could have seen any woman. However, there was not one. All present were men. But nobody seemed to think I was doing anything strange, One or two gentlemen glanced at me occasionally, but none stared obtrusively. I suppose if there was anything eccentric in the business, they accounted for it by this word: Anglaise. Breakfast over, I must again move. In what direction? Go to Villette, said an inward voice, prompted doubtless by the recollection of this slight sentence uttered carelessly and at random by Miss Fanshawe, as she bid me good-bye. I wish you would come to Madame Beck's. She has some marmot whom you might look after. She wants an English gouvernante, or was wanting one 2 months ago. Who Madame Beck was, where she lived, I knew not. I had asked, but the question passed unheard. Miss Fanshawe, hurried away by her friends, left it unanswered. I presumed Villette to be her residence. To Villette I would go. The distance was 40 miles. I knew I was catching at straws, but in the wide and weltering deep where I found myself, I would have caught at cobwebs. Having inquired about the means of travelling to Villette, and secured a seat in the diligence, I departed on the strength of this outline, this shadow of a project. Before you pronounce on the rashness of the proceeding, reader, look back to the point whence I started. Consider the desert I had left. Note how little I perilled. Mine was the game where the player cannot lose and may win. Of an artistic temperament I deny that I am. Yet I must possess something of the artist's faculty of making the most present pleasure. That is to say, when it is of the kind to my taste. I enjoyed that day, though we travelled slowly, though it was cold, though it rained. Somewhat bare, flat, and treeless was the route along which our journey lay, and slimy canals crept, like half-torpid green snakes, beside the road, and formal pollard willows edged level fields, tilled like kitchen garden beds. The sky, too, was monotonously grey. The atmosphere was stagnant and humid. Yet amidst all these deadening influences, my fancy budded fresh and my heart basked in sunshine. These feelings, however, were well kept in check by the secret but ceaseless consciousness of anxiety lying in wait on enjoyment, like a tiger crouched in a jungle. The breathing of that beast of prey was in my ear always. His fierce heart panted close against mine. He never stirred in his lair, but I felt him. I knew he waited only for sundown to bound ravenous from his ambush. I had hoped we might reach Villette ere night set in, and that thus I might escape the deeper embarrassment which obscurity seems to throw round a first arrival at an unknown bourne. But what with our slow progress and long stoppages, what with a thick fog and small, dense rain, darkness that might almost be felt had settled on the city by the time we gained its suburbs. I know we passed through a gate where soldiers were stationed. So much I could see by lamplight. Then, having left behind us the miry chaussee, we rattled over a pavement of strangely rough and flinty surface. At a bureau the diligence stopped, and the passengers alighted. My first business was to get to my trunk, a small matter enough, but important to me. Understanding that it was best not to be importunate or over-eager about luggage, but to wait and watch quietly the delivery of other boxes till I saw my own, and then promptly claim and secure it, I stood apart. My eye fixed on that part of the vehicle in which I had seen my little portmanteau safely stowed, and upon which piles of additional bags and boxes were now heaped. One by one I saw these removed, lowered, and seized on. I was sure mine ought to be by this time visible. It was not. I had tied on the direction card with a piece of green ribbon, that I might know it at a glance. Not a fringe or fragment of green was perceptible. Every package was removed, every tin case and brown paper parcel. The oilcloth cover was lifted. I saw with distinct vision that not an umbrella, cloak, cane, hat-box, or bandbox remained. And my portmanteau, with my few clothes and little pocket-book, enclasping the remnant of my 15 pounds, where were they? I ask this question now, but I could not ask it then. I could say nothing whatever. not possessing a phrase of speaking French, and it was French, and French only, the whole world seemed now gabbling around me. What should I do? Approaching the conductor, I just laid my hand on his arm, pointed to a trunk, thence to the Diligence roof, and tried to express a question with my eyes. He misunderstood me, seized the trunk indicated, and was about to hoist it on the vehicle. "Let that alone, will you?" said a voice in good English. Then, in correction, "Qu'est-ce que vous faites donc? Cette malle est à moi." But I had heard the fatherland accents. They rejoiced my heart. I turned. "Sir," said I, appealing to the stranger, without, in my distress, noticing what he was like, "I cannot speak French. May I entreat you to ask this man what he has done with my trunk?" Without discriminating, for the moment, what sort of face it was to which my eyes were raised, and on which they were fixed, I felt in its expression half surprise at my appeal, and half doubt of the wisdom of interference. "Do ask him. I would do as much for you," said I. I don't know whether he smiled, but he said in a gentlemanly tone, that is to say, a tone not hard nor terrifying, "What sort of trunk was yours?" I described it, including in my description the green ribbon, and forthwith he took the conductor under hand, and I felt, through all the storm of French which followed, that he raked him fore and aft. Presently he returned to me. "The fellow avers he was overloaded, and confesses that he removed your trunk after you saw it put on, and has left it behind at Boumarine with the other parcels. He has promised, however, to forward it to-morrow. The day after, therefore, you will find it safe at this bureau." "Thank you," said I, but my heart sank. Meantime, what should I do? Perhaps this English gentleman saw the failure of courage in my face. He inquired kindly, "Have you any friends in this city?" "No, and I don't know where to go." There was a little pause, in the course of which, as he turned more fully to the light of the lamp above him, I saw that he was a young, distinguished, and handsome man. He might be a lord for anything I knew. Nature had made him good enough for a prince, I thought. His face was very pleasant. He looked high but not arrogant, manly but not overbearing. I was turning away, in the deep consciousness of all absence of claim, to look for further help from such a one as he. "Was all your money in your trunk?" he asked, stopping me. How thankful was I to be able to answer with truth. "No, I have enough in my purse," for I had near 20 francs, "to keep me at a quiet inn till the day after tomorrow. But I am quite a stranger in Villette, and I don't know the streets and the inns." "I can give you the address of such an inn as you want," said he, "and it is not far off. With my direction you will easily find it." He tore a leaf from his pocket-book, wrote a few words, and gave it to me. I did think him kind, and as to distrusting him, or his advice, or his address, I should almost as soon have thought of distrusting the Bible. There was goodness in his countenance, and honour in his bright eyes. "Your shortest way will be to follow the boulevard and cross the park," he continued. "But it is too late and too dark for a woman to go through the park alone. I will step with you thus far." He moved on, and I followed him, through the darkness and the small soaking rain. The boulevard was all deserted, its path miry, the water dripping from its trees. The park was black as midnight. In the double gloom of trees and fog I could not see my guide. I could only follow his tread. Not the least fear had I. I believe I would have followed that frank tread through continual night to the world's end. "Now," said he, when the park was traversed, "you will go along this broad street till you come to the steps. 2 lamps will show you where they are. These steps you will descend. A narrower street lies below. Following that, at the bottom you will find your inn. They speak English there, so your difficulties are now pretty well over. Good night." "Good night, sir," said I. "Accept my sincerest thanks." And we parted. The remembrance of his countenance, which I am sure wore a light not unbenignant to the friendless, the sound in my ear of his voice, which spoke a nature chivalric to the needy and feeble, as well as the youthful and fair, were a sort of cordial to me long after. He was a true young English gentleman. On I went, hurrying fast through a magnificent street and square, with the grandest houses round, and amidst them the huge outline of more than one overbearing pile, which might be a palace or church, I could not tell. Just as I passed a portico, 2 mustachioed men came suddenly from behind the pillars. They were smoking cigars. Their dress implied pretensions to the rank of gentlemen, but, poor things, they were very plebeian in soul. They spoke with insolence, and fast as I walked, they kept pace with me a long way. At last I met a sort of patrol, and my dreaded hunters were turned from the pursuit. But they had driven me beyond my reckoning when I could collect my faculties. I no longer knew where I was. The staircase I must long since have passed. Puzzled, out of breath, all my pulses throbbing in inevitable agitation, I knew not where to turn. It was terrible to think of again encountering those bearded, sneering simpletons, yet the ground must be retraced and the steps sought out. I came at last to an old and worn flight, and, taking it for granted that this must be the one indicated, I descended them. The street into which they led was indeed narrow, but it contained no inn. On I wandered. In a very quiet and comparatively clean and well-paved street, I saw a light burning over the door of a rather large house, loftier by a story than those around it. This might be the inn at last. I hastened on. My knees now trembled under me. I was getting quite exhausted. No inn was this. A brass plate embellished the great porte cochere. Pensionat des Demoiselles was the inscription, and beneath a name, Madame Beck. I started. About 100 thoughts volleyed through my mind in a moment. Yet I planned nothing and considered nothing. I had not time. Providence said, "Stop here. This is your inn." Fate took me in her strong hand, mastered my will, directed my actions. I rang the doorbell. While I waited, I would not reflect. I fixedly looked at the street stones where the door lamps shone, and counted them, and noted their shapes, and the glitter of wet on their angles. I rang again. They opened at last. A bonne in a smart cap stood before me. "May I see Madame Beck?" I inquired. I believe if I had spoken French she would not have admitted me. But, as I spoke English, she concluded I was a foreign teacher come on business connected with the Pensionat, and, even at that late hour, she let me in without a word of reluctance, or a moment of hesitation. The next moment I sat in a cold, glittering salon, with porcelain stove, unlit, and gilded ornaments, and polished floor. A pendule on the mantelpiece struck 9 o'clock. A quarter of an hour passed. How fast beat every pulse in my frame! How I turned cold and hot by turns! I sat with my eyes fixed on the door, a great white folding door with gilt mouldings. I watched to see a leaf move and open. All had been quiet. Not a mouse had stirred. The white doors were closed and motionless. "You are English?" said a voice at my elbow. I almost bounded, so unexpected was the sound, so certain had I been of solitude. No ghost stood beside, nor anything of spectral aspect, merely a motherly, dumpy little woman in a large shawl, a wrapping gown, and a clean, trim nightcap. I said I was English, and immediately, without further prelude, we fell to a most remarkable conversation. Madame Beck, for Madame Beck it was, she had entered by a little door behind me, and, being shod with the shoes of silence, I had heard neither her entrance nor her approach. Madame Beck had exhausted her command of insular speech when she said, "You are English?" And she now proceeded to work away volubly in her own tongue. I answered in mine. She partly understood me, but as I did not at all understand her, though we made together an awful clamour, anything like Madame's gift of utterance I had not hitherto heard or imagined, we achieved little progress. She rang ere long for aid, which arrived in the shape of a maîtresse, who had been partly educated in an Irish convent and was esteemed a perfect adept in the English language. A bluff little personage this maîtresse was, la basse coréenne from top to toe, and how she did slaughter the speech of Albion! However, I told her a plain tale, which she translated. I told her how I had left my own country, intent on extending my knowledge and gaining my bread; how I was ready to turn my hand to any useful thing, provided it was not wrong or degrading; how I would be a child's nurse or a lady's maid, and would not refuse even housework adapted to my strength. Madame heard this, and, questioning her countenance, I almost thought the tale won her ear. "Il n'y a que les Anglaises pour cette sorte d'entreprise," said she. "Sont-elles donc intrépides, ces femmes-là?" She asked my name, my age. She sat and looked at me, not pityingly, not with interest. Never a gleam of sympathy or a shade of compassion crossed her countenance during the interview. I felt she was not one to be led an inch by her feelings. Grave and considerate, she gazed, consulting her judgment and studying my narrative. A bell rang. "Voilà pour la prière du soir," said she, and rose. Through her interpreter she desired me to depart now and come back on the morrow. But this did not suit me. I could not bear to return to the perils of darkness and the street. With energy, yet with a collected and controlled manner, I said, addressing herself personally, and not the maîtresse, "Be assured, madam, that by instantly securing my services, your interests will be served and not injured. You will find me one who will wish to give in her labour a full equivalent for her wages; and if you hire me, it will be better that I should stay here this night. Having no acquaintance in Villette, and not possessing the language of the country, how can I secure lodging?" "It is true," said she, "but at least you can give a reference?" "None." She inquired after my luggage. I told her when it would arrive. She mused. At that moment a man's step was heard in the vestibule, hastily proceeding to the outer door. I shall go on with this part of my tale as if I had understood all that passed, for though it was then scarce intelligible to me, I heard it translated afterwards. "Who goes now?" demanded Madame Beck, listening to the tread. "Monsieur Paul," replied the teacher. "He came this evening to give a reading to the first class." "The very man I should at this moment most wish to see. Call him." The teacher ran to the salon door. Monsieur Paul was summoned. He entered. A small, dark, and spare man, in spectacles. "Mon cousin," began Madame, "I want your opinion. We know your skill in physiognomy. Use it now. Read that countenance." The little man fixed on me his spectacles. A resolute compression of the lips and gathering of the brow seemed to say that he meant to see through me, and that a veil would be no veil for him. "I read it," he pronounced. "Et qu'en dites-vous?" "Mais bien des choses," was the oracular answer. "Bad or good?" "Of each kind, without doubt," pursued the diviner. "May one trust her word?" "Are you negotiating a matter of importance?" "She wishes me to engage her as a bonne or gouvernante. Tells a tale full of integrity, but gives no reference." "She is a stranger?" "An Englishwoman, as one may see." "She speaks French?" "Not a word." "She understands it?" "No." "One may then speak plainly in her presence?" "Doubtless." He gazed steadily. "Do you need her services?" "I could do with them. You know I am disgusted with Madame Sweeney." Still he scrutinized. The judgment, when it at last came, was as indefinite as what had gone before it. "Engage her. If good predominates in that nature, the action will bring its own reward. If evil, eh bien, ma cousine, ce sera toujours une bonne œuvre." And with a bow and a bonsoir, this vague arbiter of my destiny vanished. And Madame did engage me that very night. By God's blessing I was spared the necessity of passing forth again to the lonesome, dreary, hostile street. End of chapter 7.
Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Ophelia in New South Wales, Australia, August 2006. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 8. Madame Beck. Being delivered into the charge of the maitresse, I was led through a long narrow passage into a foreign kitchen, very clean but very strange. It seemed to contain no means of cooking, neither fireplace nor oven. I did not understand that the great black furnace which filled one corner was an efficient substitute for these. Surely pride was not already beginning its whispers in my heart. Yet I felt a sense of relief when, instead of being left in the kitchen as I half anticipated, I was led forward to a small inner room termed a cabinet. A cook in a jacket, a short petticoat and sabots brought my supper, to wit, some meat, nature unknown, served in an odd and acid but pleasant sauce, some chopped potatoes, made savoury with I know not what, vinegar and sugar, I think, a tartine or slice of bread and butter, and a baked pear. Being hungry, I ate, and was grateful. After the prière du soir, Madame herself came to have another look at me. She desired me to follow her upstairs. Through a series of the queerest little dormitories, which, I heard afterwards, had once been nuns' cells, for the premises were in part of ancient date, and through the oratory, a long, low, gloomy room where a crucifix hung, pale against the wall, and 2 tapers kept dim vigils, she conducted me to an apartment where 3 children were asleep in 3 tiny beds. A heated stove made the air of this room oppressive, and to mend matters, it was scented with an odour rather strong than delicate. A perfume indeed altogether surprising and unexpected under the circumstances, being like the combination of smoke with some spirituous essence. A smell, in short, of whisky. Beside a table on which flared the remnant of a candle guttering to waste in the socket, a coarse woman, heterogeneously clad in a broad striped showy silk dress, and a stuff apron, sat in a chair fast asleep. To complete the picture, and leave no doubt as to the state of matters, a bottle and an empty glass stood at the sleeping beauty's elbow. Madame contemplated this remarkable tableau with great calm. She neither smiled nor scowled. No impress of anger, disgust, or surprise ruffled the equality of her grave aspect. She did not even wake the woman. Serenely pointing to a 4th bed, she intimated that it was to be mine. Then, having extinguished the candle and substituted for it a night lamp, she glided through an inner door, which she left ajar, the entrance to her own chamber, a large, well-furnished apartment, as was discernible through the aperture. My devotions that night were all thanksgiving. Strangely had I been led since morning, unexpectedly had I been provided for. Scarcely could I believe that not 48 hours had elapsed since I left London, under no other guardianship than that which protects the passenger bird, with no prospect but the dubious cloud tracery of hope. I was a light sleeper. In the dead of night I suddenly awoke. All was hushed, but a white figure stood in the room, Madame in her nightdress. Moving without perceptible sound, she visited the 3 children in the 3 beds. She approached me. I feigned sleep, and she studied me long. A small pantomime ensued, curious enough. I dare say she sat a quarter of an hour on the edge of my bed, gazing at my face. She then drew nearer, bent close over me, slightly raised my cap, and turned back the border so as to expose my hair. She looked at my hand lying on the bedclothes. This done, she turned to the chair where my clothes lay. It was at the foot of the bed. Hearing her touch and lift them, I opened my eyes with precaution, for I own I felt curious to see how far her taste for research would lead her. It led her a good way. Every article did she inspect. I divined her motive for this proceeding, viz., the wish to form from the garments a judgment respecting the wearer, her station, means, neatness, etc. The end was not bad, but the means were hardly fair or justifiable. In my dress was a pocket. She fairly turned it inside out. She counted the money in my purse. She opened a little memorandum book, coolly perused its contents, and took from between the leaves a small plaited lock of Miss Marchmont's grey hair. To a bunch of 3 keys, being those of my trunk, desk, and work-box, she accorded special attention. With these, indeed, she withdrew a moment to her own room. I softly rose in my bed and followed her with my eye. These keys, reader, were not brought back until they had left on the toilette of the adjoining room the impress of their wards in wax. All being thus done decently and in order, my property was returned to its place. My clothes were carefully refolded. Of what nature were the conclusions deduced from this scrutiny? Were they favourable or otherwise? Vain question. Madame's face of stone, for stone in its present night aspect it looked, it had been human, and, as I said before, motherly, in the salon, betrayed no response. Her duty done, I felt that in her eyes this business was a duty. She rose, noiseless as a shadow. She moved towards her own chamber. At the door she turned, fixing her eye on the heroine of the bottle, who still slept and loudly snored. Mrs. Sweeney, I presume this was Mrs. Sweeney, Angelique or Hibernice Sweeney, Mrs. Sweeney's doom was in Madame Beck's eye. An immutable purpose that eye spoke. Madame's visitations for shortcomings might be slow, but they were sure. All this was very un-English. Truly I was in a foreign land. The morrow made me further acquainted with Mrs. Sweeney. It seems she had introduced herself to her present employer as an English lady in reduced circumstances, a native indeed of Middlesex, professing to speak the English tongue with the purest metropolitan accent. Madame, reliant on her own infallible expedients for finding out the truth in time, had a singular intrepidity in hiring service off-hand, as indeed seemed abundantly proved in my own case. She received Mrs. Sweeney as nursery governess to her 3 children. I need hardly explain to the reader that this lady was in effect a native of Ireland. Her station I do not pretend to fix. She boldly declared that she had the bringing up of the son and daughter of a marquis. I think myself she might possibly have been a hanger-on, nurse, fosterer, or washerwoman in some Irish family. She spoke a smothered tongue, curiously overlaid with mincing Cockney inflections. By some means or other she had acquired, and now held in possession, a wardrobe of rather suspicious splendour. Gowns of stiff and costly silk, fitting her indifferently, and apparently made for other proportions than those they now adorned. Caps with real lace borders, and, the chief item in the inventory, the spell by which she struck a certain awe through the household, quelling the otherwise scornfully disposed teachers and servants, and, so long as her broad shoulders wore the folds of that majestic drapery, even influencing Madame herself, a real Indian shawl, un véritable cachemire, as Madame Beck said, with unmixed reverence and amaze. I feel quite sure that without this cachemire she would not have kept her footing in the Pensionat for 2 days. By virtue of it, and it only, she maintained the same a month. But when Mrs. Sweeney knew that I was come to fill her shoes, then it was that she declared herself. Then did she rise on Madame Beck in her full power. Then come down on me with her concentrated weight. Madame bore this revelation and visitation so well, so stoically, that I for very shame could not support it otherwise than with composure. For one little moment Madame Beck absented herself from the room. 10 minutes after, an agent of the police stood in the midst of us. Mrs. Sweeney and her effects were removed. Madame's brow had not been ruffled during the scene. Her lips had not dropped one sharply accented word. This brisk little affair of the dismissal was all settled before breakfast. Order to march given, policeman called, mutineer expelled, chambre d'enfants fumigated and cleansed, windows thrown open, and every trace of the accomplished Mrs. Sweeney, even to the fine essence and spiritual fragrance which gave tokens so subtle and so fatal of the head and front of her offending, was annihilated from the Rue Fossette. All this, I say, was done between the moment of Madame Beck's issuing like Aurora from her chamber, and that in which she coolly sat down to pour out her first cup of coffee. About noon I was summoned to dress Madame. It appeared my place was to be a hybrid between gouvernante and lady's maid. Till noon she haunted the house in her wrapping gown, shawl, and soundless slippers. How would the lady chief of an English school approve this custom? The dressing of her hair puzzled me. She had plenty of it. Auburn unmixed with grey, though she was 40 years old. Seeing my embarrassment, she said, "You have not been a femme de chambre in your own country?" and taking the brush from my hand and setting me aside, not ungently or disrespectfully, she arranged it herself. In performing other offices of the toilette, she half directed, half aided me, without the least display of temper or impatience. N.B. That was the first and last time I was required to dress her. Henceforth, on Rosine, the portress, devolved that duty. When attired, Madame Beck appeared a personage of a figure rather short and stout, yet still graceful in its own peculiar way. That is, with the grace resulting from proportion of parts. Her complexion was fresh and sanguine, not too rubicund; her eye blue and serene; her dark silk dress fitted her as a French sempstress alone can make a dress fit. She looked well, though a little bourgeoise, as bourgeoise indeed she was. I know not of what harmony pervaded her whole person, and yet her face offered contrast too. Its features were by no means such as are usually seen in conjunction with a complexion of such blended freshness and repose. Their outline was stern. Her forehead was high but narrow; it expressed capacity and some benevolence, but no expanse; nor did her peaceful yet watchful eye ever know the fire which is kindled in the heart, or the softness which flows thence. Her mouth was hard; it could be a little grim; her lips were thin. For sensibility and genius, with all their tenderness and temerity, I felt somehow that Madame would be the right sort of Minos in petticoats. In the long run, I found she was something else in petticoats too. Her name was Modeste Maria Beck, née Kint; it ought to have been Ignatia. She was a charitable woman, and did a great deal of good. There never was a mistress whose rule was milder. I was told that she never once remonstrated with the intolerable Mrs. Sweeney, despite her tipsiness, disorder, and general neglect. Yet Mrs. Sweeney had to go the moment her departure became convenient. I was told, too, that neither masters nor teachers were found fault with in that establishment. Yet both masters and teachers were often changed. They vanished, and others filled their places. None could well explain how. The establishment was both a pensionat and an externat. The externes or day pupils exceeded 100 in number. The boarders were about a score. Madame must have possessed high administrative powers. She ruled all these, together with 4 teachers, 8 masters, 6 servants, and 3 children, managing at the same time to perfection the pupils' parents and friends, and that without apparent effort, without bustle, fatigue, fever, or any symptom of undue excitement. Occupied she always was, busy rarely. It is true that Madame had her own system for managing and regulating this massive machinery, and a very pretty system it was. The reader has seen a specimen of it in that small affair of turning my pocket inside out and reading my private memoranda. Surveillance, espionage, these were her watchwords. Still Madame knew what honesty was, and liked it; that is, when it did not obtrude its clumsy scruples in the way of her will and interest. She had a respect for Angleterre, and as to les Anglaises, she would have the women of no other country about her own children, if she could help it. Often in the evening, after she had been plotting and counterplotting, spying and receiving the reports of spies all day, she would come up to my room, a trace of real weariness on her brow, and she would sit down and listen while the children said their little prayers to me in English. The Lord's Prayer, and the hymn beginning "Gentle Jesus," these little Catholics were permitted to repeat at my knee; and when I had put them to bed, she would talk to me (I soon gained enough French to be able to understand and even answer her) about England and English women, and the reasons for what she was pleased to term their superior intelligence, and more real and reliable probity. Very good sense she often showed, very sound opinions she often broached. She seemed to know that keeping girls in distrustful restraint, in blind ignorance, and under a surveillance that left them no moment and no corner for retirement, was not the best way to make them grow up honest and modest women. But she averred that ruinous consequences would ensue if any other method were tried with continental children. They were so accustomed to restraint that relaxation, however guarded, would be misunderstood and fatally presumed on. She was sick, she would declare, of the means she had to use, but use them she must. And after discoursing, often with dignity and delicacy, to me, she would move away on her souliers de silence, and glide ghost-like through the house, watching and spying everywhere, peering through every keyhole, listening behind every door. After all, Madame's system was not bad, let me do her justice. Nothing could be better than all her arrangements for the physical well-being of her scholars. No minds were overtasked. The lessons were well distributed and made incomparably easy to the learner. There was a liberty of amusement, and a provision for exercise which kept the girls healthy. The food was abundant and good. Neither pale nor puny faces were anywhere to be seen in the Rue Fossette. She never grudged a holiday. She allowed plenty of time for sleeping, dressing, washing, eating. Her method in all these matters was easy, liberal, salutary, and rational. Many an austere English schoolmistress would do vastly well to imitate her, and I believe many would be glad to do so, if exacting English parents would let them. As Madame Beck ruled by espionage, she of course had her staff of spies. She perfectly knew the quality of the tools she used, and while she would not scruple to handy the dirtiest for a dirty occasion, flinging this sort from her like refuse rind, after the orange has been duly squeezed, I have known her fastidious in seeking pure metal for clean uses. And when once a bloodless and rustless instrument was found, she was careful of the prize, keeping it in silk and cotton wool. Yet woe be to that man or woman who relied on her 1 inch beyond the point where it was her interest to be trustworthy. Interest was the master key of Madame's nature, the mainspring of her motives, the alpha and omega of her life. I have seen her feelings appealed to, and I have smiled in half pity, half scorn at the appellants. None ever gained her ear through that channel, or swayed her purpose by that means. On the contrary, to attempt to touch her heart was the surest way to rouse her antipathy, and to make of her a secret foe. It proved to her that she had no heart to be touched. It reminded her where she was impotent and dead. Never was the distinction between charity and mercy better exemplified than in her. While devoid of sympathy, she had a sufficiency of rational benevolence. She would give in the readiest manner to people she had never seen, rather, however, to classes than to individuals. Pour les pauvres, she opened her purse freely. Against the poor man, as a rule, she kept it closed. In philanthropic schemes for the benefit of society at large, she took a cheerful part. No private sorrow touched her. No force or mass of suffering concentrated in one heart had power to pierce hers. Not the agony in Gethsemane, not the death on Calvary, could have wrung from her eyes 1 tear. I say again, Madame was a very great and a very capable woman. That school offered her for her powers too limited a sphere. She ought to have swayed a nation. She should have been the leader of a turbulent legislative assembly. Nobody could have browbeaten her. None irritated her nerves, exhausted her patience, or overreached her astuteness. In her own single person she could have comprised the duty of a first minister and a superintendent of police. Wise, firm, faithless, secret, crafty, passionless, watchful and inscrutable, acute and insensate, withal perfectly decorous, what more could be desired? The sensible reader will not suppose that I gained all the knowledge here condensed for his benefit in 1 month, or in 1/2 year. No, what I saw at first was the thriving outside of a large and flourishing educational establishment. Here was a great house, full of healthy, lively girls, all well dressed and many of them handsome, gaining knowledge by a marvellously easy method, without painful exertion or useless waste of spirits, not perhaps making very rapid progress in anything, taking it easy, but still always employed, and never oppressed. Here was a corps of teacher and masters more stringently tasked, as all the real head labour was to be done by them, in order to save the pupils, yet having their duties so arranged that they relieved each other in quick succession whenever the work was severe. Here, in short, was a foreign school, of which the life, movement, and variety made it a complete and most charming contrast to many English institutions of the same kind. Behind the house was a large garden, and in summer the pupils almost lived out of doors amongst the rose bushes and the fruit trees. Under the vast and vine-draped berceau, Madame would take her seat on summer afternoons, and send for the classes, in turns, to sit round her and sew and read. Meantime masters came and went, delivering short and lively lectures rather than lessons, and the pupils made notes of their instructions, or did not make them, just as inclination prompted, secure that, in case of neglect, they could copy the notes of their companions. Besides the regular monthly jours de sortie, the Catholic fête days brought a succession of holidays all the year round, and sometimes on a bright summer morning or soft summer evening the boarders were taken out for a long walk into the country, regaled with gaufres and vin blanc, or new milk and pain bis, or pistolets au beurre, rolls and coffee. All this seemed very pleasant, and Madame appeared goodness itself, and the teachers not so bad but they might be worse, and the pupils perhaps a little noisy and rough, but types of health and glee. Thus did the view appear, seen through the enchantment of distance. But there came a time when distance was to melt for me, when I was to be called down from my watch-tower of the nursery, whence I had hitherto made my observations, and was to be compelled into closer intercourse with this little world of the Rue Fossette. I was one day sitting upstairs, as usual, hearing the children their English lessons, and at the same time turning a silk dress for Madame, when she came sauntering into the room with that absorbed air and brow of hard thought she sometimes wore, and which made her look so little genial. Dropping into a seat opposite mine, she remained some minutes silent. Désirée, the oldest girl, was reading to me some little essay of Mrs. Barbauld's, and I was making her translate currently from English to French as she proceeded, by way of ascertaining that she comprehended what she read. Madame listened. Presently, without preface or prelude, she said, almost in the tone of one making an accusation, "Miss, in England you were a governess?" "No, madame," I said, smiling, "you are mistaken." "Is this your first essay at teaching, this attempt with my children?" I assured her it was. Again she became silent, but looking up, as I took a pin from the cushion, I found myself an object of study. She held me under her eye. She seemed turning me round in her thoughts, measuring my fitness for a purpose, weighing my value in a plan. Madame had, ere this, scrutinised all I had, and I believe she esteemed herself cognizant of much that I was. But from that day, for the space of about a fortnight, she tried me by new tests. She listened at the nursery door when I was shut in with the children. She followed me at a cautious distance when I walked out with them, stealing within earshot whenever the trees of park or boulevard afforded a sufficient screen. A strict preliminary process having thus been observed, she made a move forward. One morning, coming on me abruptly, and with the semblance of hurry, she said she found herself placed in a little dilemma. Mr. Wilson, the English master, had failed to come at his hour. She feared he was ill. The pupils were waiting in class. There was no one to give a lesson. Should I, for once, object to giving a short dictation exercise, just that the pupils might not have it to say that they had missed their English lesson? "In class, madame?" I asked. "Yes, in class, in the second division." "Where there are 60 pupils," I said, for I knew the number, and with my usual base habit of cowardice, I shrank into my sloth like a snail into its shell, and alleged incapacity and impracticability as a pretext to escape action. If left to myself, I should infallibly have let this chance slip. Inadventurous, unstirred by impulses of practical ambition, I was capable of sitting 20 years teaching infants the horn-book, turning silk dresses, and making children's frocks. Not that true contentment dignified this infatuated resignation. My work had neither charm for my taste nor hold on my interest. But it seemed to me a great thing to be without heavy anxiety, and relieved from intimate trial. The negation of severe suffering was the nearest approach to happiness I expected to know. Besides, I seemed to hold two lives, the life of thought and that of reality; and, provided the former was nourished with the sufficiency of the strange necromantic joys of fancy, the privileges of the latter might remain limited to daily bread, hourly work, and a roof of shelter. "Come," said Madame, as I stooped more busily than ever over the cutting out of a child's pinafore, "leave that work." "But Fifine wants it, Madame." "Fifine must want it then, for I want you." And as Madame Beck did really want, and was resolved to have me, as she had long been dissatisfied with the English master, with his shortcomings in punctuality and his careless method of tuition, as too she did not lack resolution and practical activity, whether I lacked them or not, she, without more ado, made me relinquish thimble and needle. My hand was taken into hers, and I was conducted downstairs. When we reached the carré, a large square hall between the dwelling-house and the pensionnat, she paused, dropped my hand, faced and scrutinised me. I was flushed and tremulous from head to foot. Tell it not in Gath, I believe I was crying. In fact, the difficulties before me were far from being wholly imaginary. Some of them were real enough, and not the least substantial lay in my want of mastery over the medium through which I should be obliged to teach. I had indeed studied French closely since my arrival in Villette, learning its practice by day and its theory in every leisure moment at night, to as late an hour as the rule of the house would allow candlelight. But I was far from yet being able to trust my powers of correct oral expression. "Dites donc," said Madame sternly, "vous sentez-vous réellement trop faible?" I might have said yes, and gone back to nursery obscurity, and there perhaps moulded for the rest of my life. But looking up at Madame, I saw in her countenance a something that made me think twice ere I decided. At that instant she did not wear a woman's aspect, but rather a man's. Power of a particular kind strongly lined itself in all her traits, and that power was not my kind of power. Neither sympathy, nor congeniality, nor submission were the emotions it awakened. I stood, not soothed, nor won, nor overwhelmed. It seemed as if a challenge of strength between opposing gifts was given, and I suddenly felt all the dishonour of my diffidence, all the pusillanimity of my slackness to aspire. "Will you," she said, "go backward or forward?" indicating with her hand first the small door of communication with the dwelling-house, and then the great double portals of the classes or schoolrooms. "En avant," I said. "But," pursued she, cooling as I warmed, and continuing the hard look, from very antipathy to which I drew strength and determination, "can you face the classes, or are you over-excited?" She sneered slightly in saying this. Nervous excitability was not much to Madame's taste. "I am no more excited than this stone," I said, tapping the flag with my toe. "Or than you," I added, returning her look. "Bon! But let me tell you, these are not quiet, decorous English girls you are going to encounter. Ce sont des labescouriennes, rondes, franches, brusques, et tant soit peu rebelles." I said, "I know, and I know too that though I have studied French hard since I came here, yet I still speak it with far too much hesitation, too little accuracy to be able to command their respect. I shall make blunders that will lay me open to the scorn of the most ignorant. Still I mean to give the lesson." "They always throw over timid teachers," said she. "I know that too, Madame. I have heard how they rebelled against and persecuted Miss Turner, a poor friendless English teacher whom Madame has employed, and lightly discarded, and to whose piteous history I was no stranger." "C'est vrai," said she coolly. "Miss Turner had no more command over them than a servant from the kitchen would have had. She was weak and wavering. She had neither tact nor intelligence, decision nor dignity. Miss Turner would not do for these girls at all." I made no reply, but advanced to the closed schoolroom door. "You will not expect aid from me or from anyone," said Madame. "That would at once set you down as incompetent for your office." I opened the door, let her pass with courtesy, and followed her. There were 3 schoolrooms, all large. That dedicated to the second division, where I was to figure, was considerably the largest, and accommodated an assemblage more numerous, more turbulent, and infinitely more unmanageable than the other 2. In after days, when I knew the ground better, I used to think sometimes, if such a comparison may be permitted, that the quiet, polished, tame first division was to the robust, riotous, demonstrative second division what the English House of Lords is to the House of Commons. The first glance informed me that many of the pupils were more than girls, quite young women. I knew that some of them were of noble family, as nobility goes in Labassecour, and I was well convinced that not one among them was ignorant of my position in Madame's household. As I mounted the estrade, a low platform raised a step above the flooring, where stood the teacher's chair and desk, I beheld opposite to me a row of eyes and brows that threatened stormy weather. Eyes full of an insolent light, and brows hard and unblushing as marble. The continental female is quite a different being to the insular female of the same age and class. I never saw such eyes and brows in England. Madame Beck introduced me in one cool phrase, sailed from the room, and left me alone in my glory. I shall never forget that first lesson, nor all the undercurrent of life and character it opened up to me. Then first did I begin rightly to see the wide difference that lies between the novelist's and poet's ideal jeune fille, and the said jeune fille as she really is. It seemed that 3 titled belles in the first row had sat down predetermined that a bon enfant should not give them lessons in English. They knew they had succeeded in expelling obnoxious teachers before now. They knew that Madame would at any time throw overboard a professor or maîtresse who became unpopular with the school, that she never assisted a weak official to retain his place, that if he had not strength to fight or tact to win his way, down he went. Looking at Miss Snow, they promised themselves an easy victory. Mesdemoiselles Blanche, Virginie, and Angélique opened the campaign by a series of titterings and whisperings. These soon swelled into murmurs and short laughs, which the remoter benches caught up and echoed more loudly. This growing revolt of 60 against 1 soon became oppressive enough, my command of French being so limited, and exercised under such cruel constraint. Could I but have spoken in my own tongue, I felt as if I might have gained a hearing. For, in the first place, though I knew I looked a poor creature, and in many respects actually was so, yet nature had given me a voice that could make itself heard, if lifted in excitement or deepened by emotion. In the second place, while I had no flow, only a hesitating trickle of language, in ordinary circumstances, yet, under stimulus such as was now rife through the mutinous mass, I could in English have rolled out readily phrases stigmatizing their proceedings, as such proceedings deserve to be stigmatized, and then with some sarcasm, flavoured with contemptuous bitterness for the ringleaders, and relieved with easy banter for the weaker but less knavish followers. It seemed to me that one might possibly get command over this wild herd, and bring them into training, at least. All I could do now was to walk up to Blanche, Mademoiselle de Melcy, a young baronne, the eldest, tallest, handsomest, and most vicious, stand before her desk, take from under her hand her exercise book, remount the estrade, deliberately read the composition, which I found very stupid, and, as deliberately, and in the face of the whole school, tear the blotted page in two. This action availed to draw attention and check noise. One girl alone, quite in the background, persevered in the riot with undiminished energy. I looked at her attentively. She had a pale face, hair like night, broad, strong eyebrows, decided features, and a dark, mutinous, sinister eye. I noted that she sat close by a little door, which door, I was well aware, opened into a small closet where books were kept. She was standing up for the purpose of conducting her clamour with freer energies. I measured her stature and calculated her strength. She seemed both tall and wiry, but, so the conflict were brief and the attack unexpected, I thought I might manage her. Advancing up the room, looking as cool and careless as I possibly could, in short, ayant l'air de rien, I slightly pushed the door and found it was ajar. In an instant and with sharpness I had turned on her. In another instant she occupied the closet, the door was shut, and the key in my pocket. It so happened that this girl, Dolores by name, and a Catalonian by race, was the sort of character at once dreaded and hated by all her associates. The act of summary justice above noted proved popular. There was not one present but, in her heart, liked to see it done. They were stilled for a moment, then a smile, not a laugh, passed from desk to desk. Then, when I had gravely and tranquilly returned to the estrade, courteously requested silence, and commenced a dictation as if nothing at all had happened, the pens travelled peacefully over the pages, and the remainder of the lesson passed in order and industry. "C'est bien," said Madame Beck when I came out of class, hot and a little exhausted. "Ça ira." She had been listening and peeping through a spy-hole the whole time. From that day I ceased to be nursery governess, and became English teacher. Madame raised my salary, but she got thrice the work out of me she had extracted from Mr. Wilson, at half the expense. End of chapter 8.